In this video, I'll be helping you out in making one of the most challenging decisions in 2022 fantasy football this year, picking between the two top wide receivers for one of the NFL's best passing offenses. In 2021, the Chargers were 6th in overall team passing plays per game, and Justin Herbert was the quarterback with the second most passing attempts in the league. Right now, his top two wide receivers, Mike Williams and Keenan Allen, share very similar draft prices, and in today's video, we'll be deciding on which one of those options is the best answer for your team. I post fantasy football content on multiple platforms every single day of the week, so make sure to drop down, click that subscribe button, and turn the bell on so you never miss a new piece of content. Before I dive into the details for today's video, drop down and let me know your thoughts on this fantasy football situation for 2022. Are you a Mike Williams guy or a Keenan Allen guy? Let me know your thoughts and why, what scoring format you play in, and let's dive into the video. All right, here you go, you guys. So I want to start out today's video diving into the Mike Williams side of this fantasy football ADP battle situation. I think that Mike Williams has one of the more polarizing outlooks for this season, and there are two very extreme sides of the spectrum that you can fall on to while you're looking to obviously evaluate him for your teams this year. So Mike Williams, first and foremost, was one of the most interesting stories of last fantasy football year. He was clearly one of the most predominant breakout players last season. He had league-winning potential in spurts and was a guy who ultimately won a lot of singular weeks for a lot of fantasy teams, posting numerous 30-plus point fantasy games and being a guy who had one of the highest ceilings for any individual performance amongst any player at the wide receiver position. Yes, this includes guys like Cooper Kupp, who did their own awesome things and absolutely killed it in the league. Guys like Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, who are putting up really, really great numbers. Mike Williams wasn't quite to the extent of some of those players, but he was right on par with that elite and upmost level of elite output in any individual performance. Now, the one thing that we struggled with here with Mike Williams, the one difference that these two players have in their situations is consistency. We'll dive into the details of how Mike Williams produced in terms of his consistency as it related to last season. We'll take a look at Keenan Allen and the body of work he's produced here as of late, but Mike Williams, again, is the name we'll be starting with in today's video. So, as you've already gotten the picture painted for you here, Mike Williams is the ceiling option in this fantasy situation. Again, his ADP is the 29.8 overall pick on Underdog Fantasy. If you haven't watched the channel before, Underdog is a place that I think has the most accurate ADP in the fantasy industry right now. There is a dollar value and an assigned draft price to enter into any league on Underdog, so the picks are insightful, they're meaningful, and they actually represent something, as opposed to the mock draft ADP on ESPN, where it's free to join and anyone can make any pick on those formats. So I truly put a lot of weight behind the numbers here on Underdog. There is the argument to be made that Mike Williams' ADP is a bit skewed in terms of how high it is because of this upside he brings to the table, because of the fact that you can kind of discount those negative games with him just being pushed down to your bench with how best ball scoring works and how lineups are built in that league. However, I do still think this is a very, very interesting situation, and with that ADP on their platform being separated by less than 2 picks, it's a very interesting situation to break down here and decide which is the better asset for your teams. So let's take a look back at the details. Let's look at the numbers. Let's dive into some of the specifics here from Mike Williams in the 2021 NFL season and talk through just how he came about having this breakout year at such a late point in his career, to be entirely honest. For a player who is now entering into a second major contract with this Chargers football team, he's a guy who had a late breakout age. This was not a player who took 1 or 2 seasons. Maybe it was, at this point in time with the elevation of our expectations amongst wide receivers, a year 3 breakout could almost be considered something rather late here for this position group. But it was Mike Williams here, despite being, he drafted in 2017, I believe, a very high first-round pick out of the University of Clemson. He breaks out here in 2021 with 15.4 fantasy points per game, improving his target share from the 2020 season, where he had a 14.7% target share of this Chargers offense on 85 targets, 5.7 opportunities per game, all the way up to 20.8% target share here with 129 looks this past season and 8.1 targets per contest played this year. So to kind of frame this in the perspective of some other players, 129 targets, it's only 20.8% target share, which isn't an eye-popping number at face value, but when you consider the offensive level of output in this passing game, the Chargers having the number 2 quarterback in terms of overall passing attempts, that being Justin Herbert. I referenced that briefly in the introduction of today's video, and the fact that Los Angeles was 6th in passing, team passing plays per game, so showing you a consistent top 10 level of output, nearly in that top 5 bubble. Those are very, very impressive to see. And this is how you get a wide receiver who on the depth chart was typically thought of, this being Mike Williams here last season, as the clear number 2 wide receiver for this football team. That is what allowed Justin Herbert to support such a high producing fantasy season for his number 2 option in this offense. If we take a look at a guy like Michael Pittman last season, who was the clear cut and dry obvious number 1 receiver for the Indianapolis Colts, he had a 25% target share of that Colts offense on the exact same amount of targets. So it goes to show you that target share number isn't always cut and dry. It doesn't tell the whole story here. Williams was on par with other number 1 wide receivers for NFL organizations in terms of the opportunities he saw per game, in terms of the value of touches he was getting in this offense. Mike Williams, again, despite being kind of thought of as this consensus number 2 wide receiver on the depth chart for the Chargers offense, still provides a wide receiver level, a wide receiver 1 level of output and opportunity as it relates to other NFL franchises. So it's really that difference in role here for Mike Williams, which we'll talk about here in like 2 seconds. It's that difference in the amount of work and the ways that they use him that ultimately produces such a higher level of fantasy output than it does for other receivers in other offensive situations. So the next thing I want to kind of touch on here is I wanted to compare some of these numbers to Keenan Allen, again, just to kind of, compare and contrast that situation a little bit. But Mike Williams, before we get there, is the efficient player in this offense. He is the big playmaker, and he is the guy that goes up, wins 50-50 contested balls downfield, and is traditionally thought of as kind of the red zone weapon for this team, the guy that's going and making, again, big plays downfield, and doesn't necessarily see the same amount of opportunity on a per-game basis, and then thus, at the end of the season, the overall body of work will favor Keenan Allen slightly in the total work category. However, we started to see some really, really positive things changing in the direction of Mike Williams this past year. Something I really wanted to talk about that I saw and kind of sparked some ideas here on Twitter lately is the change of ADOT, average depth of target. So that basically means how far downfield is this wide receiver when the football's headed his direction? How deep are his targets and those opportunities coming about here? And that's something that we've seen really evolve here for Mike Williams. We typically think of average depth of target and ADOT as being kind of a fancy cheat code. If you're producing super high numbers and having a really large ADOT, that means you're super efficient. You're a guy who can make big plays happen. We typically slap the tag of a talented player on a guy who produces on minimal targets with high ADOT. That's someone that we want to project for the future seasons to see growth in his overall usage in an offense. And that's kind of what played out here for Mike Williams. If you go back to the 2019 season, Mike Williams ranked number 1 in the NFL in average depth of target. This is a guy who, again, wasn't seeing the levels of opportunity requisite for elite fantasy production. But then as he moved into 2020, that number dropped down to 14.8 for his ADOT. His ADOT, I don't know if I said the exact numeric value, at number 1 was 17.4 yards per target, being that ADOT. In 19, you move to 2020, it drops off a little bit there to 14.8 yards as his average depth of target. And then the real key mover of the needle here when we evaluate this past season, which really shines light on how he was used this past year, is despite the fact that we think of him as that vertical weapon, a guy who's a big playmaker downfield, the truth is, you look at this ADOT number moving down to 10.7, which ranked him in the 40s amongst other wide receivers this year. he is finally starting to see his route tree open up here. He has proved with his ability to separate and win vertically that he's deserving of more opportunities, more looks, and more ultimately shots to be involved in this offense, and that's exactly the case that happened this season. Let's go beyond the numbers here for a second. Mike Williams this past season was a player that we saw really take a step forward in the trust that Justin Herbert had in him from year 1 to year 2. Having a jump of 85 targets to 129, going 44 more targets into the well here, that shows you growth, development in chemistry, and overall a willingness to give him footballs in big spots. Some of the biggest fourth down plays of this season for the Chargers offense went Mike Williams' way. It wasn't Keenan Allen, the safety blanket, every single time. We also saw guys who, this isn't, it's outside the spectrum of today's video, but someone that I'm very excited about going forward long term is Josh Palmer, a player who I think had some really, really nice opportunities late in the season as well on some of those big fourth downs. But the point being here, Mike Williams is now more than just a vertical weapon. He is now more than just a deep threat. He is now more than just a red zone weapon for this team. He can work all areas of the field. Again, he makes those 50-50 contested balls more like 75-25 balls in his favor. The analytics don't exactly look that nice, but it is something that this Chargers team and uber aggressive head coach Brandon Staley really allows Mike Williams' strengths to run their course here and to really be felt in the factors of this offense. So Mike Williams for me is someone who, as you look more in depth about how this 2021 production came about, as opposed to just looking at it as a plain and simple, cut and dry, streaky fantasy performer, has a lot to offer. And I think there's a chance that we could see even more increased levels of consistency when we look at this body of work in 2022 and what a year 3 Justin Herbert can be for this offense. However, we have to lay our case for the other side of the argument. Keenan Allen, the 28th overall pick, again, on Underdog Fantasy via their best ball ADP. Again, I speak very highly of Underdog's ADP and obviously their formula that creates it. I think it's very accurate. If you guys would like to join Underdog Fantasy Leagues with me this season, make sure to head over there to Underdog. There's links in the description of today's episode. Click on that sucker. Sign up when you use promo code SFS. Deposit $10 or more, get a 100% deposit match bonus. And the draft guide's free on my website, sizzlefantasy.com. There will be links in the cards, probably a link in the pinned comment section and in the description of today's video. Again, you can get draft guide access for just $10 and get double your money, up to $100. So for example, you put $100 in, you'll get $200 to play with, and the draft guide's free, again, on sizzlefantasy.com. I said my piece there. We'll move on. I love Underdog. I love playing in leagues. If you guys want to join a league with me, of course, I am willing to do so. Hit me up in the Discord server, again, found in the description of today's video. So back to Keenan Allen here, or rather, let's get to Keenan Allen here. We haven't really said too much. His ADP is just 1.8 pick, 1.8 overall. You even say picks, would that be plural? I'm not really sure. The fact that it isn't 2, it's not entirely 2, but it's more than 1. Let's say 1.8 picks, let's go plural there, above what Mike Williams' draft price is at right now. I believe that in this situation, when you compare these two players at the most fundamental and basic levels, you can simply slap the floor tag on Keenan Allen and the ceiling tag on Mike Williams. What do you really want to be drafting? That's the question, obviously, we're answering today. And Keenan is a guy that astoundingly, despite the fact that we view him as the floor player in this offense, actually averages more fantasy points per game than Mike Williams does. Let's look at the numbers. The floor value for Keenan Allen got him a 16.1 fantasy point per game finish in the overall broad picture of the 2021 season. I referenced this earlier, but in case you forgot, that's actually 0.7 points higher than what Mike Williams finished at 15.4 fantasy points per game, despite the fact that Keenan Allen was not a regular 30-plus point per game producer, not a player that has the same level of ceiling value as a Mike Williams. He simply was dependable and reliable enough to have steady enough performances They weren't necessarily weak or league winning. However, they were able to keep him afloat amongst the names of some of the top producers in fantasy football last season. Whereas we talked about Mike Williams' 20.8% target share last year on 129 looks, Keenan Allen's a guy who had a 25.1% target share of this Chargers offense this past season, has had 137 or more targets in a season in 5 straight years, and is coming off of back-to-back 147 plus target seasons with Justin Herbert, the current quarterback and leader of this Chargers offense. These numbers are insanely significant. Volume is king in fantasy football, especially if we're talking about the wide receiver position in PPR formats. The more catches, the more opportunities you're getting, clearly the higher floor value you have. Those are free fantasy points. That is simply catching the football and sitting down, you're accruing fantasy points. And one of the biggest numbers, despite the fact that it is one of the most average and basic numbers out there, that really stuck out to me is that despite the fact that Keenan Allen had, again, 147 targets. I'm going to stop this video just to make sure I have that number correct. Keenan Allen had 157 targets this past season, despite the fact that he had 28 more targets than Mike Williams had last season. He also managed to have 30 more receptions. The reason this sticks out so much isn't simply because of the raw numbers and the raw volume at play here. It's because of the conversion from a target to a reception. It's showing you that for every target Keenan Allen has, his opportunity and ability to convert that target into a reception is simply higher than what Mike Williams brings to the table. Why is this? Mike Williams, despite the fact that that ADOT has continued to decrease here, he's seen a larger and more prominent role in this Chargers offense, still continues to have more difficult opportunities to capitalize on and make a play than what Keenan Allen has. Despite all of these positives in Mike Williams' offensive situation and how he's molding his game, changing things, and ultimately becoming a better player, the opportunities, the low-hanging fruit for Keenan Allen is just easier to produce with. He's a guy who has a more short and intermediate refined route running tree and is ultimately able to get open closer to the line of scrimmage and see a higher volume of catchable passes head his direction. This is a player that, again, you have 28 more targets, but 30 more receptions. The receptions outweigh the target differential, and that is a big deal for me here. That's ultimately some of the reason you can start to put behind, an explanation for why a player who has a higher floor but not a higher ceiling, I would say Keenan Allen, is an afterthought in terms of ceiling value that he presents stacked up against Mike Williams, continues to have a higher fantasy point per game scoring average than what the guy with the astronomical ceiling who started off the season with multiple 30-point fantasy games is able to give you. So what does that ultimately boil down to here? Well, we're not quite ready to make a decision. I wanted to toss in a few more numbers before we make our ultimate analysis of the situation. And then we're actually going to be diving into, despite the fact that, of course, I will be making my choice here today, the inevitable truth is that someone in your fantasy league will own both of these players. So we're going to outline exactly what types of teams these two players work best with, what starts to your draft specifically should you be looking to target each of these players alongside of, and how that's all going to work out. So we're going to toggle back to Mike Williams here, the big body, the high ceiling scoring threat, and talk through some other analytics. Not super complicated stuff here. The details are really, at this point, plain and obvious. I didn't have to dig too deep into the numbers to find my explanation for today. Of course, we love to get analytical here, but also at a point, numbers are just numbers, and situations and stuff that goes beyond that is a lot more interesting to look at times as well. So here for Mike Williams, I wanted to look at red zone production. Who is doing more in the red zone? How are they making those numbers work? My immediate expectation, my prediction here, was that Mike Williams would take the swing in this territory. You've got a guy who is much bigger than Keenan Allen, a guy who's much more physically imposing, and again, that contested jump ball ability to make those plays happen clearly favors Mike Williams. For Mike here, you had 23 red zone targets, which ranked 8th in the NFL last season. Very, very good numbers. 9 total touchdowns, just 1 away from breaking double digits. Again, phenomenal stuff, top 10 numbers there. 15.1 yards per reception. Again, something that speaks to that efficiency, something that you really, really like to see here. Those numbers are great. But then when I looked over at Keenan Allen, who despite the fact that Mike gets him in the yards per reception category at 10.1 yards per reception, so he's not nearly as efficient with each of those opportunities and looks as Mike Williams is, Keenan Allen had 25 red zone targets, which ranked 5th in the league, just 2 more looks than what Mike had, but still making him a top 5 player and the more targeted of the 2 in that territory, yet he was only able to convert 6 touchdowns this year. Keenan has never been an elite touchdown scorer. He's never been someone that I've thought of as a super valuable red zone weapon, but those numbers, those passing volume analytics, show you that there's some, uncapitalized opportunity left on the table, some unrealized fantasy production that if he converts at a slightly higher rate, could start to distance himself even further from the opportunities that Mike Williams is receiving. This is what ultimately leads me to my final conclusion here. I was already tilting slightly in favor of Keenan Allen, but the fact that we have these additional red zone numbers to look at on top of the overall volume, on top of the overall consistency and floor production, the final nails in the coffin here, the dagger, if you will, are these insane Keenan Allen stats. Number 1 in total route wins in 2021. This is one of the best route runners in the National Football League, one of the best separators at the wide receiver position, and he does it because of the way the Chargers use him. It's a perfect match made in heaven. 5th in slot snaps. If you've watched the channel here, you know I am a huge proponent for slot opportunities for good route runners. The slot makes the defensive life harder. It makes the defensive back have to guard in or out breaking routes. You can run vertically still as well. It really unleashes your entire route combo. And for a guy like Keenan Allen that does everything so well, all things route running, footwork, he has some of the nastiest abilities to get off the line of scrimmage, ultimately just have insane breaks on his routes. Keenan is getting the opportunities that he needs there. He was 2nd in routes run last season, showing you that he's also having an insane amount of opportunity to work with, not only in the balls coming his way, but just the amount of times he's on the field running routes that could potentially get him an opportunity to score some fantasy points. And the last key stat that I kind of, improv'd myself here was lineup-worthy games. What do I define a lineup-worthy game as? In half PPR scoring, did you or did you not score 9 or more fantasy points? 9 is still a pretty underwhelming number. It's something not super fantastic. I didn't want to quite dip down to 8 fantasy points per game. However, I do have this analytic that I kind of just made up off the top of my head here. Again, lineup-worthy games. How many of these did you have in the past season? Again, 9 or more points per game in half PPR scoring. I determined that Keenan Allen, of his 16 contests last season, he missed a game last year. Of the contests he played last year, he had 12 lineup-worthy performances, and he missed 3 by a very small margin where he was between 7 and 8 fantasy points in those individual contests. Again, showing you that about 75% of the time, he will be a reliable lineup asset, a guy who you can depend on, is not going to win games for you, but is simply not going to lose them. And ultimately, another takeaway I really had from this situation is that if it came down to it, I would feel comfortable drafting Keenan Allen as my first wide receiver off the table. I cannot say the same thing for Mike Williams. Mike Williams, to me, is the guy who can be the tipping point, the thing that, brings you to the other side of the situation, that takes you that extra mile in those huge ceiling performances. But I cannot feel comfortable investing into Mike Williams as my first wide receiver off the board. Why do I feel comfortable with Keenan Allen in this role? It's simple. He's reliable, and again, like I said, I don't have to worry about him blowing up in my face and completely derailing the scoring for my individual week. For those of you guys who like the double hero running back draft strategy, You want to start out early in the first and second rounds and get you two really solid stud players who can be workhorses you think have top 12 upside. Address those two position groups early and then fill out that wide receiver core and the rest of your lineups in the following picks. Keenan Allen is a perfect fit for this situation. He's not necessarily, again, a league-winning player, a guy you expect to take you that extra mile in your week-to-week fantasy games, but he is a lineup staple, someone that's a set-it-and-forget-it type player in your lineups, and you don't ultimately have to worry at the end of the day of exactly what he's going to bring to the table because you know he is that safety blanket for Justin Herbert. He's playing in a high-volume passing offense, and he has an incredible role for this Chargers offense. Mike Williams, on the other hand, I can't say the same for. I can't enter into every single week this coming season wondering whether or not Mike Williams will deliver or whether or not he will fade out of my lineup and completely have a bust-worthy performance. Whereas, let's refresh you here, 12 lineup-worthy games for Keenan Allen, barely missed the bar in 3 other contests. Mike Williams had just 9 lineup-worthy games last year. Again, 9 or more points in half PPR scoring. Only 8 of those games that he had 5 or more receptions. In 8 other contests, he had 4 or fewer receptions. So you're talking about really a 50-50 split here. You know, those 50-50 jump balls, he's scoring or making that reception just over half the time. He's doing the same thing in your fantasy lineups. Just over half the time, he's having a lineup-worthy game. Just over half of the time, he's seeing a requisite amount of receptions to deliver a consistent fantasy floor here. So if I'm entering into a game with 2 running backs who might not necessarily have both of them hit in the situation we're talking about here, maybe one of your running backs is a big hit, maybe the other one's a slight bust, and then you add Mike into that situation, that really takes a hindrance on your floor here. That really caps the amount of potential you have in a given week-to-week basis. And I would feel much better drafting Mike Williams with another stud established wide receiver. I'm talking about guys, and this doesn't work out perfectly based off of ADP. This is another reason that we're leaning towards the side of Keenan Allen, is I think it just works out better with the players that would play a complementary role to Mike Williams. But I would not draft Mike unless I have already addressed the wide receiver position with a name such as Cooper Kupp, Justin Jefferson. If you're going to draft an RB in round 1, maybe that's CeeDee Lamb or Mike Evans in round 2, and then you come back for Mike Williams as your second wide receiver in the 3rd round, or depending on where ADP falls on your draft board format, or based off of what your league size is, your format, all that great stuff. There's a lot to dive into there. But the moral of the story, my takeaway for today, is in half PPR formats, standard, traditional, redraft fantasy leagues, Keenan Allen is the guy I want on my roster. This is the player that I feel most comfortable with, again, because I think you can go hero RB here, double hero RB. There's really any which way you can look about it. Maybe you want to go running back right off the bat. You come back and get one of those high upside wide receivers and then pair a super stable floor asset here in Keenan Allen as your wide receiver 2, and you're living large, you're loving life, and everything's going great for your fantasy team. So again, you guys, let me know your thoughts on this situation down in the comment section below. If you want more in-depth analysis for your 2022 fantasy football leagues, feel free to drop down and click that subscribe button. Again, turn the bell on so you're never late for a video. Go check out sizzlefantasy.com and some of the links in the description of today's video. I've got a ton more, over 500 pages of content to be exact, on that website for you guys to take advantage of, from rankings to sleepers and busts, must-own players in every single round of your leagues this year in rounds 1 through 20, a draft day cheat sheet you can print off, bring to your drafts this year, all kinds of stuff. Over 300 player profiles detailed with information about situations, pros and cons of team strength and player strength. All kinds of stuff for you guys to get involved with, take a look at, and ultimately help you become better fantasy players this season. And those come with lineup advice. So all you got to do is add me on the community Discord server. I'll get in your DMs if you're a gold member or have access to those draft guides. I'm answering all your questions. I'm right there with you every step of the way this season, and basically being your fantasy football consultant, if you will, all year long. And that sounds like a great thing to me, baby. So I want to help you guys dominate your leagues this year. I'm super appreciative for you guys checking out today's video and sticking with me. If you've been here for this long, leave your thoughts, questions, all that great stuff in the comments below. And stay tuned, because YouTube is about to show you 2 videos that you should watch next. I'll see you there. Peace out.